this podium set up. Mr. Speaker, today the House deals with one of the largest changes regarding controlled substances in my lifetime. Throughout the debate on the larger issue of legalizing recreational marijuana, I've discovered the issue is not as black and white as some members have put forward in their arguments. I want to agree with my colleague from Markham Unionville on many of the points that he raised. But I say that it's not as black and white, Mr. Speaker, and I'll give you an example. Every time the Liberal MPs talk about how legalizing marijuana will keep it out of the hands of youth, it's quite frankly asinine. And for anybody thinking that youth currently don't have access to readily accessible illegal marijuana is also rather absurd. I am well aware that Canada has some of the highest rates of adolescent marijuana consumption anywhere in the world. It is available far too often in our high schools, and I have heard horrible stories of how marijuana consumption has led to disastrous life decisions. Mr. Speaker, this can also be said for alcohol. It can also be said for crystal meth and for fentanyl and for cocaine. I don't for a moment believe that marijuana is in the same column as the illegal substances I just referenced. And it is not my intent to degrade those who consume marijuana for recreational purposes. My intent is to emphasize that we as parliamentarians should wade very carefully into the legalization of recreational marijuana and where every home in Canada will soon be allowed to grow 4 plants. I have carefully reviewed many of the submissions to the Health Committee, such as the submission from the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, the Canadian Medical Association, and the Canadian Nurses Association, and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. These are just a handful of the over 185 briefs that were tabled with committee members, and in many respects, the concerns that these well-respected organizations put forward were almost identical to those voiced by my constituents during the 5 town halls I hosted this summer on this topic. The best way to describe C45 is by quoting a Brandon Sun article that was published the following morning after one of our town halls. And for anybody who thinks the Brandon Sun is under the umbrella of Postmedia, I can assure you they are not. As the article stated, and I quote, "If a consensus can be drawn from a wide-ranging town hall in Brandon about the proposed legalization of marijuana, it's an acknowledgement the legislation is flawed," end quote. And I fully agree with what the article stated. That's why I submitted a brief to not only the Justice and Health Ministers, but to the entire committee that was tasked with studying this legislation. While not surprising, but it is still unfortunate to report, I received a boilerplate response from the Minister of Justice that did not even acknowledge the recommendations that I put forward. If a member of Parliament who is duly elected can't even get the correspondence team from the Minister of Justice's office to go above and beyond just copying and pasting, it begs the question, did this government have any intention of actually listening to concerned Canadians? Mr. Speaker, for a government that pretends they listen, the only way to get them to back down from a proposal is if thousands upon thousands of angry taxpayers show up en masse to town halls and write some of the funniest tweets I have ever heard. Mr. Speaker, or I have ever read, Mr. Speaker, pardon me. For example, during the taxpayers' revolt this summer, many farmers took pictures of themselves sitting in their combines while harvesting and referred to them as their tax shelters. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm asking the government to not only implement my recommended change of pushing back the bringing into force date of C45 to 2019, I asked them to listen to the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, who stated, and I quote, "Canadian Police Services will not be equipped to provide officers with the training and resources necessary to ensure the new regime within the existing contemplated timeframe," end quote. Or the Liberals listened to the Canadian Medical Association, who's recommending a comprehensive public health strategy with a health education component before C-45 is implemented. And if the government thinks that within the next 6 months the police services will be ready, the medical community will be ready, our education system will be ready, and that municipalities and provinces will be fully prepared for July 1st, I would humbly remind them that their own government 2 years later still cannot accurately pay public service employees. It is sad to say, but this government's credibility on implementing and executing effective policies within a reasonable time frame is not that believable. And to my honourable colleagues from across the way, and to my honourable colleagues across the way, pardon me, you have essentially ignored the plea from provinces and municipalities on asking for more time to properly prepare for your politically driven July 1st deadline. Not a single member of this House has any idea on what the rules will be in their communities because their municipal government has yet to determine what they will be. It'll cost serious money for municipal governments to properly train their law enforcement and bylaw officers, but yet will not receive the adequate financial assistance in order to do so. They're going to be stuck with all the headaches while the Prime Minister on Canada Day will proclaim that marijuana is now legal. And to expand on my recommendations to the government, the majority of my constituents believe that the federal government should not look to marijuana as a cash cow, but rather the federal government should provide a significant portion of the federal taxes they collect should go directly to municipalities in the same manner as the gas tax fund. And for any of my colleagues who believe that police and law enforcement agencies will see cost savings by the legalization of recreational marijuana, it would be naive at best to think that such a highly regulated, controlled substance, which will have more strings attached to it than even alcohol, will somehow free up their time. I have failed to see that any time that government decides to legislate, regulate, and control something that is actually results in cost savings. Now, regardless of the flaws found within this piece of legislation, there still was no overall consensus for my constituents if marijuana should be legalized, for recreational use. There were many questions surrounding the effects of one's cognitive abilities and a lack of general education surrounding its long-term impacts. And while we debate this legislation and have put a heavy emphasis on educating our youth, we must not forget that millions of middle-aged adults have next to zero experience with recreational marijuana, and that any education program must also include this demographic. It is absolutely imperative that the legalization of recreational marijuana is not rushed until the various law enforcement agencies, provinces, and municipalities are fully prepared. And I urge the government, if they plan on passing this legislation, that they rethink how the tax revenues will be distributed to those who will have to absorb many of the costs of regulating and policing. And I ask the federal government to heed the advice of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to not move forward with this legislation until they receive further direction from their municipal partners. Now, Mr. Speaker, in closing, I am under no illusion that the government has any intention of listening to the concerns of the good people of Brandon-Souris. It would be an understatement to say that I have hesitations regarding legalizing recreational marijuana. Regardless of my personal trepidations, it is clear that the country is not ready for the July 1st implementation date in 2018. It was my hope that if the government ignored every single other concern or recommendation put forward, either by myself or stakeholders, that at the very least they would push back the bringing into force date as to allow more time to properly prepare. With that, I will finish my remarks and urge my Liberal colleagues to break ranks with their whip and urge the government to listen to their local law enforcement agencies, provinces, and municipalities to do the right thing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member from Brandon-Souris for his very thoughtful remarks, and I want to assure him that we've listened very carefully, and particularly the point he makes with respect to ensuring that training and education is available to all Canadians who may choose to make the decision to use these drugs, because there are significant risks that need to be properly managed, and that information can help people be safer. But, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to address some of the concerns that you raised with respect to what we've heard from law enforcement. And I've been engaged in that conversation for almost 2 years, and I wanted to share as briefly as I'm able with the member from Brandon-Souris. First of all, Mr. Speaker, in 2008, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police unanimously urged the government of the day to make resources available for the training of drug recognition experts and for all officers for standardized field sobriety testing. And that plea fell on deaf ears. In 2013, by unanimous declaration in their resolutions, they urged the government of the day to make available to them oral fluids testing, acknowledging that technology was being used in other jurisdictions to help keep our roadways safe. Mr. Speaker, that fell on deaf ears. Additionally, very important advocacy groups around public safety, such as Mothers Against Drug Driving, urged the government to bring forward effective legislation to address some of these concerns. And prior to 2015, that plea fell on deaf ears. And so, Mr. Speaker, we've listened to those concerns from law enforcement. We've made available $161 million to provide the training, the resources, access to the technology, and the legal authorities that the law enforcement community has asked for. And when they came before us, naturally after a decade of being ignored, they were skeptical. But I have assured them, Mr. Speaker, that we are making those resources available to them and that they will have what they need to keep our communities safe.
The honourable member for Brandon-Souris.
Speaker, I appreciate my colleague's concern, but it's the biggest oxymoron I've ever heard. They obviously haven't listened to what has been said by the Canadian public, and they're the ones bringing forth the licensing of recreational marijuana, Mr. Speaker. So why the rush? If they need more time, they've got lots of it. They could do that and still put in place the proper analysis that these and training that the police forces across Canada have come to them to say that they need. The Medical Association has given them that background as well. Many reasons to take more time. The Nursing Association, as I said, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, who all of these costs are going to be dumped on. This government is not going to make any money out of this process, Mr. Speaker. In spite of that's what they're trying to lead the public, that they need this money to bail themselves out of their huge debts. Mr. Speaker, they're not going to make a cent on this because it's all going to be used up in enforcement and administration.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for South Okanagan West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. I think everybody here agrees that we all want to make Canada a safer place. We all want our young people to be safer and healthier. But I think we'd all agree, perhaps, that the situation as it stands now is untenable. And I'm just wondering what my Conservative colleagues are offering up as an alternative to this pathway to legalization of marijuana. What did they do in the previous 10 years that helped the situation, and what do they offer up for the future?
The honourable member for Brandon-Souris.
Well, I thank my colleague for his question as well, and of course, that's exactly what I'm speaking of today. When I listened to the people at the 5 town hall meetings and other events that I was at throughout the summer in my riding, we felt that it was necessary to offer the plan that I did. I even sent a letter to the public budget officer back in June before the House rose for the summer, requesting all of the information around Bill 45 and the Enforcement Bill 46, and many, many questions about how much money will be spent on enforcement, what will be needed for administration, how is it going to be done. 2 pages of questions, Mr. Speaker, that I had on my own table to ask, and we got a reply back from the public budget officer that basically said, the government, I believe, has the information, but they won't give it to me, so I can't give it to you. And Mr. Speaker, I find that atrocious. If you broadcast out there what you think you're going to make for money in this process, and then are so shameful of the results of it that you can't even put out there what it's going to cost and what the administration is, it shows to me that the government doesn't know what those costs are. It shows that they've done this too quickly, too readily, without the detail behind it, just like they did with their small business tax program.
Resuming debate.